All right, let's do this. All right, so good hello and welcome. So this is going to be the last time I do this talk for a while, but I've had a lot of fun making it, developing it, researching it, and giving it and iterating a couple of times to the different international spatial development students. And yeah, I'm just glad to have had this opportunity to develop the knowledge in myself, but also like spark some interest in other people. So it's called low impact urbanism. Let's get at it. So the talk's objective is to understand basically what to consider when you're thinking sustainability. The reason why I'm giving this talk is that I went to some younger students' pitches for one of their redevelopment plans. And I was really impressed initially with all of these sustainability criteria that they were touting about their new developments. But as soon as you dig a little bit deeper, as soon as you ask for a few more details, it all kind of fell apart. So it became apparent that they were using these terms as like hollow kind of marketing terms to try and sell the project. And this happens a lot, like in the real world, people will use these buzzwords without actually having any kind of work done behind it to back it up. So that upset me and I decided to do something about it. So this talk kind of gives you the tools and the way of thinking to kind of add a bit more substance to your sustainability practices or rhetoric or whatever. So the structure of tonight's talk, first, we'll take a look at our contribution. This is quite a short section, but just to recap exactly how we got here. The next is lexicon. This is probably the most important section. It's got the most slides and it's a little dull at times, but it's worth kind of hanging in there. And then the consequences, just recapping on that. There's some interesting ones. The philosophy, this one's also really interesting. Philosophy of low impact urbanism. Finally, some important elements you can consider when you design your sites, some like a checklist that you can kind of go through and be like, have I addressed all of these elements? So our contribution, obviously the urban space is as a result of, at first, a matter of survival. We had to tame the environment so that we could survive. And that was true up until probably the Industrial Revolution. And then after that, it became a matter of indulgence and kind of expansionism in some sense. Our standards of living have improved since the maturity of the Industrial Revolution, but not hugely, whereas juxtaposed to the environmental damage is massive. So I want to start this off with one quote by Thomas Hobbes. He said just before the start of the Industrial Revolution, he said in England, if I desire to travel from here to there, my freedom to act can be impeded by as much as a high wall, an impassable river, or by another person. Any external obstacle that prevents me from exercising my power, that keeps me from getting what I want, or otherwise would be able to attain, diminishes my liberty. So you can see this sense of entitlement that that the industrializing nations had at the time. So think about that. Any high wall, any impassable river, or any person will not get in my way. I will drill a hole through the hill. I will build a bridge over the river and I will remove the people that are in my way. So this is an incredible kind of place, I think, where proper urbanism began in the Industrial Revolution. I think it's important to be aware of that context. So my two guests, one of which can't use her mic, and the other who can. Anne, what do you think of, what are some like flaws with green and sustainable? I prefer environmental impact and I'll explain why, but what do you think is like an issue with green and sustainable?
As terminology, I would say, sustainable is not necessarily like you can talk about it in the social, in the financial, or environmental context. It's very vague. You can talk about sustainable development goals, which go into very different directions as well and might even contradict each other depending on what development you're looking at. And green, then, there are things that are green but still have a massive environmental impact depending on how you do them. So yeah, it's all very, it's not measurable. It's not that measurable. You can frame it in however way you want. So it doesn't mean much.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. And I think that people use it wishy-washy wherever they like. They're chameleons hiding behind the words. And also, like, my other thought is that green is very corporately adoptable because it's a color. So you see like corporations painting that on everything, and it does work fairly well for the average person. But for us professionals, I prefer environmental impact. And the reason I do is because it's far more specific. It'll help you argue your point better. So if you are able to explain the environmental impact, both negative or positive, of whatever you're doing, then you'll be able to justify yourself better. So environmental intellect, the degree to which human object or activity creates a change to the composition and or process within the atmosphere or biosphere. So there you have that, like a lot more detailed kind of rhetoric to look at it. So for example, a scooter, before the scooter, you have all of the mining and the material extraction and processing. During the life, you have the petroleum that's used within it and all the pollution that comes from that. And then after, you have wherever it's going to go. So that's why I think that environmental impacts, like low environmental impact, is what us as professionals should be aiming for, and then use this structure as a way to explain it. And that takes us quite nicely onto the circular economy. So we're talking about that Vespa and how it has this very linear process. This is something else that came up a lot in the talks with students. And they were saying, yeah, like we'll have a circular economy within our neighborhood. And you're like, okay, but how? How are you going to achieve that? Because it's an incredibly difficult thing. One example of repair, that first one, which is by far the easiest to do. The UK at the moment has currently started funding town councils to put repair stores in their high streets. So I think by 2025, every town council has to have some kind of repair store available in their high street. So when you're shopping, you can always take like your toaster in to get repaired instead of having to throw it out. Same with shoes, same with all these things that when a professional does it, is not too hard to address. The materials need to be near endless, reusable. So that either means a biosynergy, where it's either entirely reusable, like steel, for example, has a very low degradation over time, whereas plastic does. Plastic can only get recycled 3 or 4 times before it starts. It needs to be mixed in with virgin plastic, whereas steel can be melted and reformed many hundreds of times before like the oxidation content builds up. Either that or it's completely biodegrade. So you either have a man-made system that loops this all back in, or you let the natural system do the same. And that's one of the only ways you can get to circular city. Another interesting element of this as planners or any kind of policy makers is how do you make this economically viable? How do you make what was waste into a resource that is cheaper than anything from the outside of your city or your space? A lot of like reuse of materials has to be designed into the policy from the get-go. Carbon neutral, another great one. There's a difference between carbon neutral and net carbon neutral. Net carbon neutral normally means that someone's buying a bunch of carbon credits, planting trees in a foreign country in the hope that they become net carbon neutral. But sometimes people will say carbon neutral when they mean net carbon neutral. Carbon neutral is incredibly hard to attain for anyone, especially in the developed world. I believe that this neighborhood that you can see on screen now is possibly carbon neutral. If they are growing more trees, 50% more trees than they're burning, then they're carbon neutral. So the cost in this picture, the carbon in this picture is in the foreground. You have the fireplace where they're burning for heat and energy for cooking. And in the background, you have the glass in the windows and the plastic of the chairs that both required a considerable amount of carbon to be created. So for this neighborhood to be carbon neutral, it has to have taken an area and is now growing plants which are absorbing carbon to build their structure. That's the only way. Let's take a quick look at scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. This is quite a complicated thing. And I'll tell you right now that most professionals don't quite understand how to work with scope 3, but scope 1 and 2 are pretty easy. Scope 1 is all of the energy that you are directly responsible for. So everything that you choose how it's burnt or how it's used. For example, when you put fuel in a car, that is your scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 is when you are using energy that is outside of your field of control. For example, when you flip on the light when you get home, that's scope 2 emissions for you because you have no direct say as to how that energy is generated. Yeah, and then scope 3 is all of the economic activity that is stimulated by your existence. So driving the car and flipping the lights both have carbon impact, but they have knock-on effects. So for example, the carbon cost of you just burning the fuel itself is your scope 1 emissions, but scope 3 emissions with that was the carbon that was burnt to get the fuel to you because you've stimulated that activity. So that's kind of the little distinction between the two. It's quite interesting. Urban resilient is something quite entertaining. I think urban resilience gets too much clout, whereas urban mitigation doesn't get enough. But it's important to understand resilience either way. I believe that there's 2 ways to do resilience. There's either diversifying your sources or enriching and enhancing the one network that you have. For example, think about like ecosystems. When you have one species that will only eat one other species, then if that like origin, the fuel species, gets cut out for some reason, then they're impacted immediately. Whereas in other species, they eat a wide variety of their input. And that means if one of them goes down, if one of their feed species goes down, then they will still be okay because they have other options. And this often in a built environment perspective in like nations depends on how stable your nation is. So in the developing world, you see that a lot more of diversifying sources happening. So for example, instead of you being sure that the power will come on because the one system in the country does that properly, you have 2 or 3 ways that you can have energy and light, or stuff that, you have candles and solar panels and a lot of blankets and stuff. So you diversify your solutions and your sources so that you have resilience. Whereas enriching would, for example, in the bottom right, you can see the vertical farm is a good example of enriching a linear economy, like a supply base. Because say, for example, in the future, when the weather gets really dry or really rough or something, the vertical farms will be better off than the crops in the fields. So you have those 2 methods of urban resilience. And then just fun at the end here, the lexicon, we're at the end of the boring stuff. The solar punk, which I find pretty cool. Punk is just like anything alternative. Think like timber punk, steampunk, cyberpunk. But solar punk imagines a colorful kind of nature inclusive world, which is quite cool. And then cohabitation as well is something that I think we're starting to reason about. You can see underneath the train there's deer. And that like bringing those species, instead of having a monospecies environment, we have more biodiversity within there. So, but you need cohabitations, you need strategies for cohabitation to make that work. The consequences we're all very aware of. Things are going to get intense, and that will have effects, which will have further effects on us. Some examples of stuff that will happen to you and I, like later in life, we'll see as these primary, secondary, and tertiary effects start to happen around the world, we'll see higher inflation of certain currencies where climate change hits the hardest. We'll see higher insurance rates on waterfronts and stuff, property. We'll see tighter restrictions. We're already seeing that at the moment with like carbon capping and so on. The restrictions of like what we can do as a species begins to get more and more tight. Social shifts, higher rents, higher energy prices, and more limited accessibility to goods. So that's something that we can almost certainly look forward to in our future. But we can, as professionals, do an incredible amount to get around it. So there are 2 parts of the problem as far as I see it, and as far as like this philosophy sees it. There's the biosphere, so the damage we're doing to the ground and the soil, which is not as pressing an issue, even though it's affecting biodiversity, is directly affected. But the one we are most worried about, or at least most humans are most worried about, is the fact that the atmosphere is rapidly degrading and covering us in a blanket that we don't want. And that causes city stress. Those 2 elements cause the stress, urban stress. The solution in your designs and in your policies needs to be based in high ecology to fight that biosphere damage in the past, especially in urban areas, and low CO2 planning and policy making to mitigate towards the atmosphere. Low CO2 or even CO2 negative, which is again very difficult to do. And that's how you create resilience, is by using those 2 elements in the front of your mind. We're getting towards the end there. This is our second to last one. So there's some things that we consider quite a lot. How do we move from A to B? So electric cars, walking, cycling, and how do we get and consume our energy, solar panels and stuff. That stuff that's all over the media and in everyone's consciousness, like every person's consciousness. But there's a lot more that you can do as a policymaker and planner or whatever to be just the next level. Some of them include, so this is an example of diversifying demands. This is my balcony. I have had tires out there over the summer, and I'm still drinking the mint tea that we made, which is quite cool. So that's an example of like where my inputs, so the third to last inputs, get inputs and do with their outputs. So that's reducing the impact. Cool, I think. This is material use. CLT is incredible. At the moment, it's between 15 and 30% more expensive, and that's with an underdeveloped supply chain. But even at the moment, you have 80% less carbon for the building frame, and it's 5 times lighter and has a similar strength to concrete. And then this is another good example of good material choice. If you don't need it, why is it there? Another really good one. So these cob houses are really awesome. If this person walked away from their home in 100 years' time, it would have all degraded and gone back into the earth, which is an important element. This is an interesting example. It's called Greenhouse, and it's in Melbourne. This architect decided that he wanted to play with how to fit all of the inputs and outputs that he needed as a family, his family. How could he create everything that his family needed in terms of food? And how could he process everything he needed on site? So it's a fascinating, and there are a couple documentaries on it. It's a fascinating case study. And finally is some of the software. Not enough people think about how you can do, for example, an overall structure to make sure that the cities or regions are collaborating together. Density is an important principle in planning, and financial cooperation is incredibly important. Also, something that not many people know about is the subsidies and stuff that are happening at the moment, and increasingly happening as progressive governments are elected and pushing money towards these things, as people really should look into what subsidies are available to them. This is a really good example from Utrecht in the Netherlands. This development is the closest thing I could find to a low impact development. You can see here the transport planning is interesting, but also things like how are we going to hold biodiversity in this space? I think that's just so important to have that interaction. There's a QR code there, quick, if you want to snap a picture. 3, 2, 1. And there we go. That was kind of the presentation, just some things to think about. To finalize, I'll say, be honest. Don't use these words unless you have something to back them up. The second is we're needed. The world is like scrambling to try and reach their decarbonization goals. And finally, we're very lucky. We're so lucky to be at this time. I think we'll see more urban change in the next 100 years than we did in the last 100 years. So I'm super excited to see that happen. And I'm glad we can be a part of it. So yeah, thank you guys for coming in.